So that's my demo merchant view of our new portal. So first things first, right? So we launched some small improvements since last year in the styling of the portal. Some of you that are used to it will probably notice that overall the fonts and the color scheme is a bit more contrasty compared to what we had last year. So we improved it a bit in terms of visual guidelines, try to make it easier to understand and also easy on the eyes in sense of contrast between colors, backgrounds, icons, and fonts, okay? So this overall makes the portal a bit cleaner, right? A bit more modern looking, and we hope you also appreciate these changes, okay? So in terms of functionality, now with this launch, I'd like to say that we concluded the main work that we had when we started actually migrating our applications to the new platform. So we have still on the left pane the typical applications you had access to when you want to configure your merchant setup. So still able to configure provider contracts, routing, checkout configuration to the order and define how payment methods will behave in the payment page. Our risk management app, where you configure some simple rules for blocking transactions. Our automatic retry tool for retrying recurring transactions in case of failures. And other configurables such as generating API tokens for testing, as well as configuring access to different people in your team, okay? So the main applications continue to be the same, to behave in a similar way as we had before, but now we redesigned the user interface to hopefully give you a better user experience as well, okay? So let's try to go through the main process of displaying how a contract with a payment service provider is configured and see how that looks like when we move to routing and start testing, okay? So the first step when you log into the portal is to move to the provider contracts application. Here you're gonna have an overview of all PSPs you have configured so far for your merchant. And it's here where you can start as well configuring new payment service providers for you, okay? So to do that, you hit add contract. That's the blue button on the right top side. This will give you access to the configuration wizard where you pick a provider from the list of integrated providers for a platform and you start configuring how it's going to be used in our system, okay? So for example, let's just pick our own internal task PSP, okay? So let's type here task PSP, right? For some payment providers, we give them different options because this represents either different adapters that we have in the backend or different use cases. So for example, we have several PayPal providers, PayPal adapters that represent basically the evolution of PayPal over the years, right? Where we integrated express checkouts. We also updated some legacy APIs they had. And for our own task PSP, we have a task MPI version and the classic task PSP, which is used for basically anything related to testing the API. So let's configure this one. I select it and hit continue. On the second screen, then is where you select basically where and with which payment methods you want to use that payment service provider. So here for the sake of keeping simple, let's just pick MasterCard and Visa, all right? If you want, normally for testing, you don't need to be very specific. You can leave it as a global provider, but in some use cases, we know that you may have a contract with a provider that is valid only within a specific country or group of countries. So in that case, you can click on Add Country on the right side and then pick from our list, the countries that apply to that contract. But for the sake of simplifying our work here, I'll just keep it global. Move to the next step. Here's where you normally give the API parameters. These are the parameters that the provider gives to you once you sign a contract with them. In the case of our task PSP, just any dummy gateway URL is necessary. So for example, just use example.com. Right. So normally In the case of a real PSP, that's the point where you give different security tokens, API keys, some other configurables that define how the provider is going to be used. And this list of input parameters will change accordingly to the provider. Okay, so we hit continue. At this point now we select in which divisions we want our providers to be working. So in our system, the concept of divisions is basically a way of having different sub-merchants inside your main merchant, all right? So how does that work, right? I have my main merchant here, my demo Payoneer merchant, and I have created 2 divisions inside it, right? So the default one, that's the one that comes out of the box, and I have a second division here. When I create divisions, I can have 2 things with them, right? So first, I can associate providers specifically to one or all divisions if I want. So I assign providers specifically to divisions. Second thing is, once I configured routes, I can have different routes per division as well, okay? So for example, you could have divisions that map to use cases in your business. For example, a division for guest customers, a division for VIP customers, or perhaps a division for services, a division for new products, a division for on-sale items. And depending on the division where you are, you may want to associate different providers. Perhaps, let's say, if you're in a VIP customer area, perhaps you want a provider that has better acceptance rates. Or if you are in a gas division, perhaps you want to have a provider that have a better fraud capability, so to avoid having issues with customers that you don't know. So you're free to create as many divisions as you want and associate providers to them also as you want, okay? Then we move to currencies. This again follows basically the contract you have with a PSP. In my case, I'm gonna keep it simple and just leave it for all currencies. But perhaps if your PSP limits you to use their systems only, let's say with euros or dollars, that's the point where you select a specific currency and pick it from our drop-down list, okay? So for my task here, just leave it as all currencies. I continue to the next step. Here's where I input our costs and transaction limits. This has different capabilities, okay? So the first of them is to give us a way of, let's say, putting a PSP to work within certain transaction limits. Let's say, perhaps I want to use my task PSP here only if the transaction is below 100 euros, right? So I can do that by setting the value here, 100. Or perhaps I want to know, once I have a second provider, I want to be able to use this provider here because it's always cheaper than that one. So I could set its costs according to what the PSP told me. So let's say my PSP costs me 10 cents per transaction. The other PSP I have costs normally 20 cents per transaction. I can set this value here as a fixed cost. And once you send the transaction to us, you can configure a routing strategy that picks the cheapest of them for you. And you can do this as a global configuration, so for any method or any country, or if you have a provider that where you specify just above the methods and countries grouping, different countries and different method combinations, you could also pick them here and give these configurables also specifically to these combinations, all right? So at this point here is basically a way of optimizing a little bit how your costing structure is going to be defined within your provider portfolio. Okay, so in my case, I'm going to leave it empty. I'm just configuring this for the purpose of testing. So normally when you're testing with us, we configure test PSP at a very basic level because the goal when you do first tests is actually to be able to simulate API responses, simulate as well our payment page. So normally such specific details are not necessary, but of course you can still apply them here if you want to test how this behaves in real life. We continue then to the next step, which is basically additional settings, right? So this is where we enable or disable 3D Secure. This is valid only outside, of course, of the new PSD2 regions. So for example, if you're in Europe, this will not have any practical effect. But outside of that, you can still enable or disable it if your provider allows you to do that. And this is where we also enable various registration options. Okay, so our system is also fully capable of performing credit card and tokenization for you, so registrations with tokenization, and we can also simulate that with SPSP. Okay, so at this point, you would be ready to finish the configuration, and we should be done configuring the contract. So for all contracts you have, so let's go back. Let's perhaps go back to the beginning, right? So for all contracts you have, you want to do this, right? So let's say you are working with Adyen, Braintree, WordPay. You're going to be configuring the contracts in our system. You can do that initially on Sandbox, right? So that you have a chance actually of testing how our API in conjunction with their services work. And then when you're ready to go live, you move to our also production system, configure these providers also in live mode, and you can start processing payments immediately. Okay. So after you're done configuring your providers, you want to go to routing. Okay? So that's the second step after it. When you go to routing, you're going to see then our famous routing table. You're going to notice some small changes in terms of styling here. Okay. So we changed a little bit the fonts and again the contrast, and made the iconography a little bit more polished than what we had in the previous versions. And in this routing table, we see on top all countries where we configured so far provider. And on the left side, first column, we see all payment methods that have a provider as well supporting them. Okay, so this is the combination of everything I configured so far in my provider screen. All right. And then what we can do here in this screen is, for the combination of a payment method and a country, I can select which or how many or how my payment providers will be routed. Okay. If the table is very long, like my case here, you can filter it. You can go on top and say, you know, I want to configure now only MasterCard. Or perhaps I can be even more specific and say, you know, I want to configure MasterCard specifically in Germany, and pick Germany from the list. Okay, so let's leave it open like that. I think it makes for an easy demonstration still. So let's say I want to configure it in Germany. So I have MasterCard in Germany. I click on it, okay, and then I see my routing strategies on top. So this is very similar to what we had in the previous versions of the portal. Okay, so this hasn't been changed. First routing strategy is called fixed order. That's the one we have here on the screen. This is a classic cascading option for providers, okay, where we enable our providers and a transaction submitted in Germany for a MasterCard is going to be cascaded across them. So how it works in practice, we're on Sandbox here, that's why we have Task PSP. Okay, so on live, it's still not a possibility. But on Sandbox, how this works is with Task PSP, right? So we submit a transaction. If that transaction is declined, our system is going to try to recover it with the next provider in sequence. If that transaction again is declined, we try to recover the third one, the fourth one, and so on. Okay, this is the same on live. The only difference is that on live we do not have Task PSP as a possible payment service provider. So we will cascade transactions across the providers we enable in the system, and we cascade them according to the result codes they give back to our adapters when we try to process a transaction with them. So of course we evaluate first the result code, because in some cases we know that we should never retry a transaction, right? So for example, if my first provider indicated that this could be a fraudulent transaction or there's a high risk value involved with it, then in that case we would decline it entirely and not proceed with cascading. But if we received a so-called, a more soft response, we could retry with the next provider. So if you don't have a clear reason, or if the provider indicates that there was an issue with processing but doesn't necessarily block it for processing, we could retry with the second, third, fourth, and so on. So theoretically, it doesn't matter how many providers you have. Okay, so if you had 1,000 here, we could still cascade across them. In practice, we know that you probably have only one or maybe max 2 providers in your cascading sequence. Okay, To change the order of these providers, you just click, drag and drop, and now we have ADN on top, checkout.com as the second option, test PSP as the third option. So it's pretty easy. I drag them around. If I like that configuration, I hit save, and that route is complete. I can now move to a second route, configure it, or I can hit save on top, and basically I'm done with my work, okay? So first option is fixed order. We cascade our transaction cost PSPs. Second option is called fixed share, okay? So in fixed share, we distribute, let me disable just this provider here before moving there, it's just a bit easier. So with fixed share, we distribute our processing across our providers, okay? So let me enable it like this so it's a bit easier to see, right? So we distribute my volume of transactions across the providers. So in this example, for example, having two providers, I initially give 50% of my transaction volume to Adyen, 50% to checkout. Okay, so it means that I can use this for A/B testing. I could set them equally and say, you know, I will follow these providers for a period of 3 months. I'm sending over these 3 months an exact same number of transactions to each of them. So let's say I send 5,000 transactions each. And I can evaluate after 3 months, let's say, how fast each of them was in processing my transactions, okay? So since they got the same amount of transactions, I could directly compare them, right, one against the other. So if I see that, say, checkout.com processes on average 100 milliseconds faster, we conclude immediately that this would be most probably my best choice, okay? We could test several things. We're gonna go real quick later to our transaction monitor. Test acceptance rate. You could follow perhaps the amount of failures you had. It depends on what you really want to optimize. All right. If I enable more providers, then we try to distribute them evenly. Okay, so for example, 20% each. And you can always, of course, change the percentage specifically for a provider. Okay, so I could raise or decrease that number accordingly. So if I want to have, for example, half of my transaction volume being sent to merchant pay and distribute the rest across the others, I can do that. Okay. Then the last option is called least costs. In this option, we just activate our providers and our system picks them based on the costs that we defined in the provider contract screen specifically. Okay, so if I said that Adyen costs to me, you know, those 10, let's say 10 cents, as I said before, checkout 20 cents, merchant pay 30 cents. We always pick Adyen first and then cascade to the second cheapest, then the third cheapest, okay? So that's a way of trying to optimize your costs. And this is, as I said before, right? It can be a global rule or it can be also specific to a combination of country and payment method, okay? So at this point, oh, sorry, I'm not going to save it. But at this point, normally we would be done actually with our configurations. We could already start processing on Sandbox and see how the system behaves. So here what we have is, if your customer comes into your payment page, when you create a payment session with us, our API asks you to send us a country code, okay? So it's been designed in a way that expects you to have multiple shops in different countries. So in my case here, I would have a Canadian shop, a German one, a Spanish, a French, a British, and so on. And for these specific shops, I tell, okay, now I'm creating a payment session, let's say for the German shop. So when your customer comes to that shop, we're gonna display payment methods that are enabled in Germany. So now I have it pre-filtered, but in my case, then it will be Amazon Pay, Apple Pay, MasterCard, as you saw before, and so on, all right? So when your customer pays, let's say with MasterCard, as we had before, our system is gonna behind the scenes cascade, right? So I left fixed order as my saved option before. Our system is gonna cascade these transactions without the customer even knowing that that's happening. So it's really transparent to them. is going to cascade transactions potentially across the provider selection. Okay, so at this point, it means you could go to Sandbox, create payment sessions, display our payment page, and start testing them. Okay, and then since we are using real providers in Sandbox, we could even use their own test cases, right? So I could use Adyen test credit cards, test values. They have specific CVC and card combinations to test declines or acceptance or 3D Secure 2. So you could be using that as well in our Sandbox to process, to perform testing. Okay. All right. So in terms of, let's say, changes, from here on, the other applications, they still have been applied to the general contrasty fonts and general colors, but in terms of functionality, I believe we don't have much new going on here, right? So we still have the checkout configuration app where we are able to basically configure how the payment page looks like in terms of the order of payment methods that you want to display, and also how you want to display them, right? So you could also add some probability numbers to do a sort of A/B testing, try to hide or display it at random values. And you can also configure how checkboxes for card registration are displayed. Okay, so in our world, let's say, you can collect credit card data from your customers, register in our system, tokenize it with providers, and when you do that, you can give your customers the option to explicitly check for card registration. So the person is going to see a checkbox in the payment page and see, I want to save this card for future purchases, and that is going to be done in this drop down here, or somehow force it, right, where you could either display the text but no option for them to uncheck the box, or not even display the text, right? So you would be registering cards. You should most probably put in your checkouts a message to the customer where, you know, he knows that his card is going to be stored in our system, but in the payment page itself, there's not going to be any checkbox. Okay, so this is an option that we give as well to you. You can use on Live or Sandbox, and with this tool, the checkout configuration tool, is basically where we can configure how the payment page is going to look like and how it's going to behave. Okay. Then moving real quick here to the risk management app. So here's where we give some risk rules that define how transactions will be blocked in our system. To create a new rule, you simply hit the blue button on the right side. There's two kinds of rules in our platform. It can be either value-based or threshold-based, aka velocity checks. Okay. Value-based means transactions will be blocked based on some specific variable. So for example, I can pick them from the drop-down list. Let's say you can block a transaction if it comes from a specific IP address, or if there is a specific customer name that perhaps sounds too fishy to you, or a specific email address or domain. Perhaps people use, you know, fake email address generators to try to trick your system. Okay, so you can block them by absolute variables. This can be a variable that you define here, or you can set first a list. I can jump in there later. So you can set a list of such variables and import it here. So let's say I can give it an Excel file that contains lists of holder names that I found, at least in past, being connected to fishy transactions, and then we import the list here. Or I can just say, you know, I go directly here and say, the payment account holder name is, you know, and then you give Joe some name. All right. So in that case, if any customer tries to pay with a card and the card says, my name is Joe, the card is going to be blocked. Okay. Second option is by thresholds. All right. So these are velocity checks. So again, you pick a variable. So let's say IP address, and then you move to how you define the velocity for that check. Okay. So IP address. So IP address has more than, let's say, 10 different values, let's say for the same payment accounts within the last 5 minutes. Okay, so if more than, so there were 10 different 10 different IP addresses for the same payment account in the past 5 minutes, from there on, we're going to be blocking such transactions. Okay. So either of these two values, this is a block that happens on our end. Okay. So it's a way of configuring simple rules. I know that a lot of the online gaming and gambling merchants configure that. There's a simple way of blocking suspicious transactions right at the gate. And this doesn't incur you any extra costs, okay? Because it's still on our end. We do not ask for anything extra for that. And normally it means that you're probably saving also some money in transactions with PSPs for most probably not tricking their own fraud or risk evaluation systems. So it's a simple way of defining blocking rules that will you on the long run probably save some money and also help you as well blocking potential problematic transactions. So for example, let's hit save here. We're going to be saving such risk rules. And just to show you the list of values, so here's basically a simple setting, right? I can create a new list, and here I can give it some description name to it, and import, whatever variable I want to block. So for example, specific countries or email addresses, IPs, names, and so on. Okay, so I can use these lists as a reference to the rules I set in the previous tab. All right. So in the previous tab, I can either refer to lists or to absolute values. That depends on how I want to set my risks. All right. So moving to automatic retry. So that's our old ADN system. So basically it's a way of configuring our system to retry transactions, or better, retry recurring transactions case they do not go through for some reason. Okay, so this is done by evaluating our combination of interaction code and reason, right? So this is basically our mapping of provider response codes, and is a way of automating our system to retry a transaction case a transaction fails and is classified against one of these codes. So for example, if I try to send a recurring payment against a credit card and the response came back saying that the account was not activated, mapped to retry, I can say, you know what, retry again in 7 days. If it fails again in 14 days, if again in 21 days, so basically every week, right? And then 28 days. Or if the credit card has been expired, perhaps you hope that your customer is going to receive a new credit card soon. So I could also configure a retry option here and give it a retry schedule period. And here you can configure different ways. Okay, so it can be by hours or days, any amount you prefer, or specific month days as well, so calendar days, right? So in some countries, for example, let's say the country has insufficient funds. In some places, people get paid by the 15th of the month, so you could also go for that. Or perhaps you can configure a setting that says, if the credit card is expired, I can try again next month or so on. So you're free to define the way you configure here. And together with this tool, we have the automatic expiry and retry, right? So this is basically a way of guessing the new expiry date of an expired card. That's it's being a feature that we had for a couple of years now. And it works basically like that, right? So you had a stored card in our system. If you try to trigger recurring transaction against it and it fails because the card has been expired already, we can configure different ways of retrying with the same card number, but updating the expiry date. Okay. So for example, in the setting I have here, let's say the card expired this year, so the 4th of 2022. So I would be retrying again with plus 3 years, so 2025, and 26, and 27. So I can add different configuration values here to be a bit more specific if I want as well. Okay, and it can be either for any bins or specific bin combination. So I could perhaps address specific banks or specific countries. They normally have slightly different rules. It could be also, let's say, a bit more specific there. And the last option, or perhaps normally even the first option, it would be to create API tokens. So that's basically where you create new tokens to test against our API, okay? It's very simple. You hit new token, you give it a description. So for example, webinar, it creates, at this point, we generate the token. So that's the API key used to test against our system. You copy it, you store, for example, in a tool you use for testing. I use Insomnia, some people use Postman, some people use even other stuff out there. So you store that API key, all right? That key is necessary to be used against your immersion code. That's how we authenticate your API requests. And from that point on, you can basically start testing our system. This is displayed only once, okay? So if I close this window, I cannot see the key anymore. That's done for security purposes, but it means that if you lost the key, or perhaps you don't know who got access to that key, it's very easy to simply come here and delete it, all right? So normally, when we test on Sandbox, just instruct our merchants to do exactly the same. So if you lost access to a key, or you don't know anymore who has access to it, it's just safer to generate a new one and delete the previous ones, all right? So let's move now, just show some of the applications on top, right? So we still have the same, as I like to call, monitoring, so transaction monitoring applications. Let me show you transactions. That's where we had a couple of changes in the recent past, especially with this new portal launch. So we revamped the user interface a little bit. So we try to make it a bit easier to use. So on top, we still have the same filtering capabilities as we had before, but now we display them, at least to me, in a way that is a bit easier on the eyes and is also a bit easier to manipulate. Okay, so now I can move the columns around. I can reorder them by clicking on the column codes. If I click on a transaction, that transaction is going to open on a side window, so a floating window. Okay, I can see the transaction details right away. I don't need to close the entire list of transactions as I had before. And if I want to move to more transactions, I can simply click on them and they're going to be reloaded here on the side window. All right. We still have basically the same information as I had before on this window. Some of them have been moved around for the sake of simply making it easier to understand what's going on. So for example, here you see we have a successful charge, start as a list request, and basically 40 seconds later, it became a successful transaction. If I want to see more details or complete details, I still have the full JSON data at the bottom. I show details and I can see them. This is basically how this transaction is being mapped into our system. And it's also a way of developers basically using it for testing purposes. Okay, so if you want to understand what happened, what exactly our system got when you send an API request to us, you can see here. Okay. So other options you still have in the transaction monitor is refunds. Okay, so if your user has access to that, you can still click in here and do either a full or a partial transaction refund. Okay. This is also available live, but know that this is also dependent on specific providers. Okay, so provider support is necessary here. Our tool will support, or our API will support partial or multiple partial refunds, but some payment service providers do not, or they have some limitations there. So we still need to observe that when testing or processing live. Okay. And this is a bit of transactions, right? So still the same export capabilities. I could still filter my transactions on top. I could click on the wheel and define which columns I want to have in my final reports. And once I hit export, I'm able to save them that as a CSV file. Okay, so for example, you could export, let's say, transactions in Germany for the past 30 days and send it, let's say, to your business analyst to to evaluate the performance of your providers, okay? Or you could be more specific and export only Adyen transactions or only MasterCard transactions. So this is possible by filtering the details on top. All right. The other tools are still existing, right, as we had before. So our KPI dashboards, our customers tool, and our technical monitor, although we haven't touched the functionality. Okay, so this continues to work exactly as before. The KPI dashboard is a simplified way of showing key performance indicators for your company. They're based on KPIs pre-configured in our system, and their values are going to be showed to you as cards on the screen. So we still have customers as more or less a parallel tool to the transactions monitor, where the focus is not on pure transactions in your platform, but transactions by a customer. So I know that some of our merchants also use that as a way of perhaps dealing with support, perhaps trying to solve specific issues for specific customers. So it's basically an easy way of looking for a customer name or a customer number and filtering the transactions only by these people, okay, in our system. And the technical monitor, also basically our legacy tool, but still pretty much used by our developers and also our people in-house for exploring transactions in a bit more detail during development. Okay, so it's a tool that we haven't touched yet. We don't plan really to change it too much. It's going to be kept in the near future as a legacy tool. It's a tool that works fully on live and on sandbox, but that's something that we're probably not updating because we're going to be reworking still. I got logged off by mistake. Still on our transaction monitor. So it's been 40 minutes. So from my end, that's more or less it, right? So in terms of functionalities, as you can see, we had some slight upgrades, okay? Some slight changes in the user interface, some new functionality. And from now on, we're gonna be building on top of what we have here, okay? So some changes that are coming in the near future. First of them is a total revamp of the team management view, okay? So right now, we have a way of adding users, as you well know, okay? So you add a user per email, you give them some permissions set in our system, and that's it. In the near future, we're gonna revamp the entire permission system to be a bit more specific to use cases and also a bit more specific to what users can see or change or delete in our platform. So this is a big revamp that we're working on already. It's already in test internally. We have several task groups as well, together with designers. They're testing different ways of approaching this. And it's a change that I'm actually really looking forward to. And hopefully in the next webinar very soon, we're gonna be able to show you already how it's gonna look like. Another big change is also coming to transactions, as I wanna mention before, okay? So the main reason why we're not touching the technical monitor is that we wanna make the transactions tool a bit of a mix between what we currently have in this tool, in the existing transactions, and what we already have in the legacy technical monitor, okay? So some details, some technical details that are only possible right now, you see in the technical monitor, are going to be ported over here, right? So details on API communication details sent to providers or specific responses they send back to us. This is all going to be ported over here. And we want to launch as well some new features. For example, we want to have a way of comparing transactions. That's been a long requested feature. You will be able to open several transactions at the same time on the screen and compare them. For example, if you want to investigate, you have a specific issue happening to you on live and you're not exactly sure what's going on, you can open similar transactions on the screen and compare them side by side and try to find exactly which parameter or which point in that transaction made the problem happen, okay? And we're also going to revamp a little bit how we display transactions. So give more details in the transaction history, try to give you more access to look for transactions or similar transactions from the same customer, basically link what we currently have in transactions, technical monitor, and a bit of what we have in customers as well. So you would be able to, let's say, load the transactions as I have on the screen. You would see a customer number as I have here, and you could click on that customer and see exactly who the person is and when the person has been registered in our system and so on. So that's a big revamp that I'm also really looking forward to. And again, hopefully very soon we're going to be able to talk about it. Okay, so from my end, I think now I am finally done. It was a pleasure to be here. Thank you for paying attention. And if you have any questions, feel free to raise your hands or to drop a question in the Q&A. Okay, so thanks a lot.